If you were to ask me to give you just one reason why I'm an atheist, I could probably condense it down to a lack of sufficient evidence for the existence of a god or gods. But if you were to ask me why I'm not a Christian, it would be a lot harder for me to give you just one answer, because the Bible and most Christian interpretations come packed with a plethora of fatal problems. Any one of them is enough to bring the entire house of cards crashing down, but one of them stands above the rest as the most damning catastrophe for the Christian faith. And you don't need a PhD in history or extensive knowledge about science, religion, or philosophy to see why. And no, it's not the problem of evil or suffering. This is the problem of instruction, Christianity's fatal error. The God of the Christian faith is often referred to as an omni-god because he's believed by most Christians to be omnipotent or all-powerful, omniscient or all-knowing, omnibenevolent or all-loving, and omnipresent. He's basically everywhere at once. Some apologists prefer the term maximally great.
God can be defined as a maximally great being. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world.
If you assume that this kind of God exists, then you're left with a major problem. The problem of instruction. To understand this conundrum, we first need to start with a hypothetical, a thought experiment. Forget everything that you know about the Bible for just a moment and pretend that you're in a hypothetical alternative universe with a different omni-god. If this deity is all-loving, all-knowing, omnipresent, and all-powerful and is trying to communicate the most important message in the universe to his or her children, how would they communicate this vital message? And conversely, if this god either didn't exist at all or turned out to be limited in knowledge, love, power, or locality, what would you expect to see instead? In the first scenario with the omni-god, you would expect perfect communication. Any decent newspaper editor knows that the average person reads at or below the 8th grade level, and they tailor their paper accordingly, so as to be widely accessible and easily understood. They avoid technical jargon and ambiguous words as much as they possibly can, and they provide clarification and define and explain what they mean when they need to. We should expect that an all-knowing God of the universe who created the brains of their target audience would know this, would know our cognitive and linguistic shortcomings, and would craft this critical message with similar precision. Now, there's a number of reliable ways that this message could be perfectly transmitted. At first, I thought maybe God could place enormous, divinely protected plaques all over the world with very literal, extremely clear instructions on them. These plaques would be indestructible and tamper-proof, since what good is a divinely inspired message without divine preservation? As society and language change, the messages could update to ensure maximal clarity, keep up with current events, and meet the needs and answer the questions of God's children, sort of like God's message board. Or he could write a message for all of us to see in the sky, or even on the moon. But then I thought, not everyone's literate or speaks the same language. Some people are blind, etc. But remember, no challenge is too big for an all-powerful God, and an all-loving God would care enough to overcome this challenge. If God is everywhere at once, he could just tell us his message in person and coach us directly. But some people might argue that his presence would overwhelm us, and while I think that's kind of a cop-out, I do acknowledge the objection. So what if instead each person received God's message in their own language, hand-tailored for them, such that it's perfectly communicated in a way that everyone would understand and reach the same conclusion? A message preloaded into everyone's brains, mental firmware that we're all born with. It would come straight from God, not through human authors. It would be directed to all mankind from the get-go, not just to a tiny handful of self-proclaimed chosen people. And there would be no internal inconsistencies in the message, no historical contradictions or scientific inaccuracies, and unlike with a conscience, what we deem as right and wrong wouldn't change from culture to culture, and you wouldn't have psychopaths who lack one altogether. This would be a ubiquitous, accessible, clear, and perfect message, because the communication of a perfect God should be perfect. But what if the alternative was true? What if there's no God at all, or the God/gods who do exist aren't omni-gods like the God of the Bible? Well, we'd expect to see a very, very different result. We would expect to find wildly different religions popping up all over the world, written by scientifically ignorant ancient authors desperately trying to make sense of their tiny, myopic view of the universe around them. You wouldn't expect to find any supernatural insights about germs, neurochemistry and mental health, heliocentrism, DNA, any knowledge of other galaxies, or any information not already available to their primitive cultures. At best, you might occasionally just get a few lucky guesses here and there. Many, if not most, of these holy books would place humanity at the center and contain stories about human experiences, of violent warlords, superstitions, wild legends, human heroes, and of unseen monsters lurking in the dark. Morality would vary from culture to culture, with some even sacrificing animals or even fellow humans to the gods. But strangely, no gods would step in to correct these gross misconceptions about their bloodlusts or mentor humanity on right and wrong.
Is he asleep?
No. I'm pretty sure he's dead.
Instead, cultures would have to progress morally on their own, because these holy books would be chained to the morality of their time, justifying barbaric practices like slavery, witch burning, because yes, they would still believe in witches, homophobia, sexism, genocide, etc. Of the many religions springing up everywhere, some would fizzle out, while others might be more relatable and would spread more rapidly. They may contain more contagious ideas with stronger sticking power. If you haven't realized already, Christianity is described perfectly by the latter scenario, in direct conflict with its insistence on the existence of an omni-god, a claim on which the truth of the Bible is entirely contingent. But it gets even worse for Christianity. For those who don't know the history of the Bible, it was concocted millennia before the printing press, video cameras, or the internet, in a small, rural, mostly illiterate backwater by otherwise insignificant goat herders searching for spiritual significance. Its contents were compiled and molded over time like a patchwork of stories, with centuries between the events described and when they were actually written down, a multi-generational game of telephone. And centuries more passed before they were finally copied onto our oldest surviving manuscripts. None of our original documents have been divinely preserved. For example, the story of the Exodus, if it did occur, would have happened sometime between the 15th and 13th century BCE. But most scholars don't think it was actually compiled into its current written form until centuries later, sometime between the late 6th and 4th centuries BCE. And our oldest surviving, albeit fragmentary, manuscript of the Exodus dates to no earlier than 250 BCE, about 1,000 years after the events described. And it's even worse for the older stories in the Bible contained in, say, the book of Genesis, like Sodom and Gomorrah or the flood and creation myths. And even the various later manuscripts that have survived are riddled with copying errors, mistakes, and changes between them. Passages have been added and removed. For example, Matthew 18 jumps straight from verse 10 to verse 12. That's weird. And just one chapter earlier, Matthew 17 skips from verse 20 to verse 22. These missing verses weren't in our earliest manuscripts, but were added later and were considered part of the Bible for centuries before we discovered these older manuscripts and edited these verses back out. The same is true for the ending of the Lord's Prayer, although some translations like the King James Version still leave this later addition in, while others don't. By contrast, Matthew 12:47 also isn't in our earliest New Testament manuscripts and was added later, but unlike with these other examples, this one was never removed. The same is true for the story of the woman caught in adultery. These are just a few of the many known examples of how the Bible has changed over time, and we'll never know the exact number of edits that have occurred since we don't and probably never will have any of the original texts. The Bible is riddled with scientific inaccuracies, internal contradictions, and mistakes where it deviates from the historical record. I've done in-depth videos on all of these things, and that's not to mention the addition of all of the horrifically immoral sanctions contained in its pages. Sure, it's easy for apologists to say that these are all misinterpretations of God's intended message, but doesn't that speak to God's failure as a communicator? Does God not understand the minds of his creation or the importance of clarity? Or is he not capable of clear communication? Unless he doesn't exist, isn't present, or doesn't care. No matter how you look at it, this is strong evidence against the God of the Bible. But imagine for a moment that the Bible is true, but all of the verses on, say, slavery in the Bible aren't meant to be taken literally. After all, a benevolent God would never condone something so utterly atrocious. But it's written literally, it's taken literally, and for thousands of years, God sits back and watches, arms folded, as millions of people are enslaved, with his words used as the primary justification for it. And he offers not so much as an amendment or a clarifier. During this time, it would take centuries of Old Testament laws before this perfect, inerrant message would finally get an update, a New Testament. But even with the New Testament, after 1,000 years of beta testing his laws, when God could have patched the system with some type of a clarifier about not owning another human being, we would instead get slaves obey your masters, leading to centuries more of religiously sanctioned atrocities. And even if none of that was the case, and this message was completely perfect and had been communicated perfectly, much of the world still doesn't have access to it. Human translators have painstakingly tried to translate the Bible into every language on Earth, and after thousands of years, their job's still not done. And all the while, linguistic metaphors and figures of speech have inevitably been lost in the process, unintentionally changing the meaning of the text, which is why in English alone there are dozens of different versions of God's inerrant message. A message so nebulous that countless interpretations have emerged from those versions, splintering Christianity into tens of thousands of denominations, with entire wars being fought over who's reading it correctly. With all the clarity and precision of a Jackson Pollock painting, core doctrines had to be voted on by people interpreting a loose collection of translations of copies of copies of copies, which happened hundreds of years after the stories allegedly took place. And even after all the books in the Bible were finally finished, for centuries there would be no consensus on which of these books were even canonical and should be included in the Bible, and which shouldn't. And even today, there's still some disagreement over this. Theologians, pastors, and apologists have dedicated decades of their lives to desperately attempting to somehow salvage this wreck, crafting books, sermons, and lectures filled with mental gymnastics and riddled with logical fallacies. Although, one thing that most of them agree on is that we don't actually know who wrote most of the books of the Bible. They're anonymous! Now you might be wondering, with a communication problem this massive, how has this disaster spread so far and wide? Well, one way is through emotional trauma and fear, instilling in people the fear of eternal damnation, teaching them that they have a problem before attempting to sell them the cure. It's also been spread at the tip of the sword, forced upon the conquered, on natives and slaves. Generation after generation has indoctrinated their children, teaching them to believe baseless assertions on faith, teaching them that faith is a virtue. Entire countries have adopted Christianity as part of their culture, making it a part of a collective identity, fearing that the alternative was divine wrath here on earth in addition to the eternal torturous hellfire of the hereafter. Fear is an extremely powerful tool. And as for the skeptics who dared to doubt, well, for centuries, non-believers have been denigrated from pulpits everywhere, shunned, demonized, ostracized, and sometimes even killed, all for simply being honest enough to point out a few of these glaring problems.
To the atheist watching this telecast, if our belief in God offends you, move. There are planes leaving every hour on the hour, going every place on planet Earth. Get on one. We don't want you, and we won't miss you. I promise you.
And the cherry on top of all of this is that the Bible is so long, so convoluted, archaic, and cryptic that most believers have never even read it through cover to cover, because if they did, they would see for themselves exactly what I'm talking about. If this idea is new or interesting to you, or you find some value in the videos that I make and the way that I present them, you can support my work with a per video pledge on patreon.com/holykoolaid, a monthly pledge on Subscribestar, or a one-time donation on PayPal. Your support is what allows me to do this full time, to pay my editor, to cover all my equipment costs, my travel costs, research, and all of the time that it takes to make these videos. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. Thank you guys so much for your ongoing support of the show, and as always, dare to be curious, but don't drink the Kool-Aid.